Narcissism isn't confidence. It's a defense mechanism. That single idea can rearrange how you understand every difficult person in your life. The partner who can't apologize, the parent who turns every conversation back to themselves, the coworker who treats feedback like a personal attack. Here's the part almost nobody knows. When someone with narcissistic traits experiences rejection or criticism, brain imaging shows their pain centers activate the same way they would if they'd been physically struck. Not metaphorically. The same neural circuitry that processes a broken bone processes being told no. That fact alone explains why confronting a narcissist almost never goes the way you hope. The grandiosity you're seeing isn't strength, it's armor over a wound that never properly closed. Stick around because in a few minutes we're going to look at the difference between the narcissist you can spot from across a room and the one who can sit beside you for years without ever being recognized. And that second type is usually the more dangerous one. But before we get there, we need to clear up what narcissism actually is, because the word has been used so loosely, it barely means anything anymore. On social media, narcissist has become shorthand for anyone selfish, vain, or annoying. That's not what the term means clinically, and collapsing the two does real damage. It makes people dismiss genuine patterns of harm as just personality quirks, and it makes people misdiagnose ordinary self-confidence as pathology. Narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is a specific clinical diagnosis. Psychiatrist Otto Kernberg, one of the foundational researchers in this field, described it through what's called object relations theory. The idea that narcissistic personality structure forms early when a child's emotional needs go unmet in a particular way, and the child learns to build an idealized self-image to survive the absence of authentic validation. That idealized self becomes a kind of internal performance the person has to maintain for life. But here's the part that gets lost in pop culture. Narcissism isn't a light switch. Psychologist Craig Malkin, who developed what he calls the narcissism spectrum, argues that everyone has some narcissistic capacity, and a healthy amount is actually useful. It helps you advocate for yourself, recover from setbacks, walk into a room without shrinking. The spectrum runs from too little, where a person can't access self-worth at all, through a healthy middle, up to the extreme high end, where self-image becomes so fragile and so central that almost nothing else can hold the person's sense of self together. NPD lives at that extreme end. Not just anywhere someone seems a little full of themselves. Clinically diagnosable, NPD is estimated to affect a small percentage of the population, while narcissistic traits, without rising to a full disorder, show up far more often, which is part of why so many people recognize patterns in a boss or a partner without that person ever being formally diagnosable. So if narcissism is a spectrum and most people sit somewhere in the middle, what makes the extreme end actually different? Not in behavior, but in the brain itself. This is where the research gets genuinely striking. Researchers at the University of Duisburg-Essen used MRI scans to compare the brain structure of people with high narcissistic traits against control groups, and they found measurable physical differences, not just personality differences. The first is in the anterior insula, a region deeply involved in empathy, especially the kind of empathy that lets you feel another person's emotional state as if it were partly your own. In people with stronger narcissistic traits, this region showed reduced gray matter volume, less tissue, less activation, which lines up with something many people who've dealt with a narcissist already sensed. It's not that they're choosing not to care. The machinery for automatically feeling what you feel is, to some degree, structurally diminished. The second difference shows up in the prefrontal cortex, particularly the areas responsible for regulating emotion, weighing long-term consequences, and inhibiting impulsive self-protective reactions. Reduced gray matter here helps explain something else. People notice the disproportionate reaction to small criticisms, the inability to sit with shame or embarrassment without immediately deflecting it onto someone else. These scans weren't subtle differences buried in noise. They showed up as some of the most consistent structural findings in the personality disorder literature, replicated across multiple samples. Put those two findings together, and a picture starts to form. A brain with a thinner empathy circuit and a less regulated emotional brake system isn't a brain that's villainously choosing cruelty. It's a brain that's poorly equipped to process the very thing healthy self-esteem requires, tolerating the small bruises of everyday rejection without collapsing or lashing out. And, critically, these aren't differences anyone chose. Gray matter volume isn't something a person can simply decide to change through willpower, which is part of why lectures and ultimatums tend to bounce right off. That's the wound under the armor we mentioned earlier. But not every narcissist looks the same on the outside, and that's exactly where most people get it wrong. When most people picture a narcissist, they picture the overt type, loud, dominant, visibly self-promoting, the person who needs to be the center of every room. That version is real, and it's the version pop culture has trained us to spot instantly. But there's a second presentation, and it's the one almost nobody is watching for. Covert narcissism. Instead of grandiosity broadcast outward, covert narcissists often present as shy, anxious, even self-deprecating. They don't announce their superiority. They imply it through constant martyrdom, through being quietly convinced no one appreciates how much they sacrifice, through a kind of fragile, wounded specialness that asks to be rescued rather than admired. Picture two people at the same dinner party, one dominating the conversation with stories of their own brilliance, the other sitting quietly, sighing about how unappreciated they are at work. Both may be running the exact same internal script. Neurologically, both types appear to share the same underlying structural patterns that reduced insula and prefrontal activity, but they cope with the internal wound in opposite directions. The overt narcissist externalizes by dominating. The covert narcissist externalizes by appearing harmless while quietly extracting reassurance, sympathy, and control. Because covert narcissists rarely look like the stereotype, the people closest to them, partners, adult children, close friends, often spend years doubting their own perception before they can name what's happening. That's exactly what makes the covert form more dangerous in close relationships. It doesn't trigger your defenses because it doesn't look like a threat. So, if you can't out-argue the brain wiring and you can't always spot it coming, what can you actually do when one of these people is already in your life? This is the part worth waiting for, because there are three evidence-informed approaches that don't require the narcissist to change at all. They only require you to change your exposure. The first is the gray rock method. The idea is simple. Narcissistic behavior is often fueled by emotional reactions from the people around them. Anger, tears, defensiveness all function as fuel. Gray rocking means making yourself deliberately uninteresting to react to. Flat tone, minimal detail, no emotional charge in your responses. You're not trying to win the interaction, you're trying to stop being a source of supply. The second is strategic boundary enforcement. This isn't about delivering an ultimatum and hoping it lands. Confrontation tends to trigger exactly the defensive escalating response we talked about earlier, because to a wounded prefrontal insula system, a boundary can register like a threat. Strategic boundaries work differently. They're stated once calmly without justification and then enforced through your own actions rather than through their compliance. I'm not available for that conversation. And then you simply leave the room every time without re-explaining yourself. The third is emotional detachment practice, sometimes called the 50-50 rule by therapists. Assuming any interaction might go only half as well as you'd like, so you're not relying on someone whose internal wiring makes consistent empathy structurally difficult. This isn't cynicism, it's calibrating your expectations to the actual person in front of you, not the person you wish they were, which protects you from the cycle of hope and disappointment that keeps so many people stuck. Used together, gray rocking reduces the fuel, boundaries reduce the access, and detachment reduces the damage when the first two don't fully work, which, with someone whose wiring resists change, they sometimes won't. None of these strategies fix the narcissist. None of them are supposed to. They protect the only nervous system you actually have control over, yours. Understanding the brain behind narcissism doesn't excuse the harm it causes, but it does something almost as useful. It takes away the mystery, and with it, a lot of the self-blame people carry for not being able to fix someone who was never going to be fixed by effort alone. Next video, we're going inside what chronic stress is physically doing to your body at a cellular level, including how it actually accelerates aging. Publishing Tuesday. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next time.